Hey there, I'm James Nash. I'm coming to you today from my little home studio to give you a demo of the new Line 6 rig. This is the new pod, the HD500, and this is the new tube amp that they've done in conjunction with Bogner. They call it the DT50. It's a digital front end and a tube back end. It's got EL34s, runs about 50 watts. And I reviewed this pair for the magazine and I was impressed with it. And of course, anytime you start talking about new gear, especially modeling gear, one of the questions that comes up is how does it sound like next to the old gear? And I thought I'd give you a little demo of that today. So this is a 1972 50-watt Marshall Super Lead. It's basically in stock shape, but it's running real well and sounds good. It's a reliable amp that's stood the test of time, you know. I'm running this through a Hermit cab. And if you look in this thing, it's got a 65-watt Celestion and a Sennheiser 609 microphone in it. And the cool thing about this cabinet is, of course, you can close it up and control the volume a little bit, which is what I have to do in order to run this thing in my home studio without anybody calling the cops. So we'll be listening to the Marshall like that through the Hermit cab. And then what we're going to do is turn around and run the Line 6 rig through the same Hermit cab, so the same speaker, same cabinet, same microphone. Doesn't even have to move the mic. I just plug the jack, and so you get a real clear idea of how the two things compare through the same signal chain. Now, before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about this Line 6 rig, because the way this pod and the amp link together, they call it the L6 link. And it gives you a lot of options in how you run the thing. So one way, of course, to use a pod is to plug straight into the thing and then run out of it directly into your digital recorder and use the speaker and the microphone simulation and all that. So I'll run the pod that way to give you an idea of how it sounds. But that's not the best way that this rig sounds, because you've got a real tube amp and a real speaker sitting here. So the best way to make this thing sound is to run the pod through the amp. Now in this case, I'll be running it out to this cabinet, but same difference. It's the amp section working on the DT50. Now there's still two ways to do that. One way is to use the output modeling on the pod, which means you basically get a master volume control on your amp here that you can turn up to get whatever volume you want, and then you simulate the sound of a cranked old amp using the digital guts in here, and I'll show you what that sounds like. But the best sound, I think, that you get out of this rig is if you use it more like an old non-master volume vintage amp, and that is you use what they call a preamp only model, which is a much cleaner model. It doesn't have any of the fake tube output distortion. You get a clean sound, and then you jack up the master volume here and you get the thing really loud. Now, of course, that defeats the whole purpose of having a master volume because you're blasting your amp. But what I find is that then I start to get sounds that really do start to compare to some of the classic amps that are out there. And it's really cool that this rig gives you the flexibility to do any of those things. So, you know, if you can be loud, you can crank the thing and get those tubes working. And if you turn it down, you can fake the sound a little bit, and you can be the judge listening to this, how close it can get. So let's start out with the Marshall. So let's check out the Line 6. I'm going to use the pod and the DT50, and I'm going to set them up in the way that I think they sound the best, and I think the way they sound the most like an old vintage amp. And that is using what Line 6 calls a preamp only model, which is a clean front end sound, and then jack the master on the amp to get the power tubes working in the same way that the power tubes were working in the old Marshall. And maybe we can get in the ballpark of the kind of tone that we got there. to be fair to the pod, they don't have a model of a 50 watt Marshall. The closest thing they have is a Park 75, so that's the model that I'm going to use. And I'm almost glad that they don't have a model of this exact model amp, because I think that's kind of beside the point anyway, whether it sounds exactly like this amp. What I'm looking for personally is, can I get a sound out of this that has the same kind of vibe and is musical in the same way that an old amp is, not whether it sounds exactly the same. So let's see how we do. I'm going to turn this up. Now when I start to turn up the master, what you'll see is that it's pretty clean. That's the preamp that you're hearing. The power tubes aren't working. We'll keep turning the master up the way we would with an old amp, and the power tubes are going to work harder and harder until... All right, so that's about where we had the old Marshall, I think. Oh, also, let me tell you about the volume here. I should have pointed this out in the last video. I start these things out with the volume on 5 to kind of show you how the amp cleans up, and then at some point I'll turn it all the way up to 10. And you'll see the difference there. So it'll be the same as in the last video. So I got to the end of the video and realized that I never used the bridge pickup with the Marshall. So there we go. Alright, so let's move on with the line 6. I dropped the master volume way down in the amp, so we're at a low volume now. And I kicked in one of the full models on the pod to make up for the loss of real output gain distortion. Now we've got modeled output gain distortion. And it's at a much quieter level that we can raise up and down and put wherever we want, you know, with a real sort of master volume style, because we're not relying upon the output tubes there. So... Okay, so much less volume. What I'm going to do is turn the mic pre up by 10 dB, and that'll make up for the loss that we have there. And so it's going to sound about the same volume on the video now, but of course it's much, much quieter.